Sarah walked into the bar expecting a quiet drink after a long day of work, but what happened next left her speechless. The bartender, someone she'd seen 1,000 times before, ignored her, not once, but repeatedly. She raised her hand for attention, trying to catch his eye, but he didn't even glance her way. Frustration bubbled inside her, but she brushed it off. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he just didn't see her. But then it happened again, and again. She sat there, getting more uncomfortable with each passing moment, as the bartender served every other customer with a smile. She wondered, was it just her? Was it something about her? The longer she sat there, the more it became clear. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. But Sarah didn't just walk away. No, she decided to stand up, confront him, and find out exactly what was going on. But the real twist? When the bartender realized who she was, everything changed in an instant. What happened next? It will shock you. It was supposed to be a typical evening. Sarah walked into her favorite local bar, the one she'd been coming to for years. She liked the place, the low hum of conversations, the clink of glasses, the familiar faces. Sarah had worked hard all week, and this bar was her place to unwind, sip on a drink, and recharge. Her mind had been preoccupied with the stresses of work, but tonight she was determined to enjoy herself. She slipped into her usual seat at the bar, tucked in the corner. The bartender, Jake, was a young guy she'd known for a while. Always friendly, always quick to greet her with a smile when she walked in. Tonight, though, things felt different. The usual warmth wasn't there. "Hey, Jake," Sarah said, a casual smile spreading across her face as she settled into her seat. "Just the usual, please." Jake didn't even look at her. His back was to her, and he was busy pouring drinks for two men at the end of the bar. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. She thought maybe he hadn't heard her, so she waved her hand in the air, trying to catch his attention. But nothing. He went on with his work, ignoring her as though she were invisible. "Jake!" She tried again, this time louder, trying to get his attention. The two men were still chatting away, and Jake was still busy mixing their drinks. No acknowledgement. Sarah sat back in her seat, taken aback. This wasn't like Jake. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he didn't hear her. It happens sometimes. She looked around to check if the place was crowded, but it wasn't. The bar had a few patrons, but nothing unusual. She decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Surely it was just a mistake. So she waited. She sat there, tapping her fingers on the counter, quietly growing impatient but still hopeful for some sign of recognition. Minutes passed. Sarah watched as Jake moved between customers, serving drinks and chatting casually with regulars. Yet, every time he came near her, he never even glanced in her direction. He didn't offer a friendly smile or a quick nod like he normally did. He just passed by her like she didn't exist. She glanced around at the people seated nearby. Everyone was either engaged in conversation or sipping their drinks, but no one seemed to notice the way Sarah was being ignored. Everyone else was getting their orders, being served promptly, but not her. She couldn't help but wonder, was she imagining this? She had been here countless times before, and Jake had always been courteous. But tonight was different. And the more she thought about it, the more it became clear. It wasn't a mistake. Jake was deliberately ignoring her. Sarah couldn't believe it. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the way Jake had treated her tonight felt wrong. Something about it didn't sit right with her, and a cold, uncomfortable feeling began to settle in her chest. Why was he ignoring her? Was it because of how she looked? The color of her skin? She stood up, quietly but firmly, her thoughts swirling. Maybe if she confronted him, he'd realize his mistake. But she wasn't sure if this was a mistake at all. Sarah stood up slowly, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her shoulders. She felt a twinge of discomfort, a growing sense of being invisible, but she tried to push it aside. Maybe I'm overthinking this, she thought. After all, it wasn't like Jake had been rude, just inattentive. Still, the unease in her stomach couldn't be ignored. She adjusted her bag on the bar stool and stepped closer to the counter, leaning in slightly. She caught Jake's attention as he poured a drink for another customer. He glanced over, just for a second, before turning his focus back to the men at the far end of the bar. She watched as he mixed their drinks, laughing at something one of them had said, but still not acknowledging her. This time, Sarah wasn't going to wait. She had a feeling this was more than just bad timing. Her throat tightened as she called out again, a little louder this time. "Jake," she said, her voice more firm. "Can I get a drink over here?" Jake paused, but only for a moment. There was no quick smile, no recognition in his eyes. Instead, he seemed to shrug it off. He finished preparing the other drinks and handed them to the men, ignoring her completely. Sarah blinked. For a moment, she thought maybe it was just his way. Sometimes bartenders get into the rhythm and forget someone's waiting. But when he didn't even look at her as he passed by, it hit her. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. She glanced around at the other patrons, trying to gauge if anyone else noticed. The bar wasn't crowded, but people were chatting, laughing, engrossed in their conversations. No one seemed to be paying attention to her. Sarah's heart began to race slightly. The uneasy feeling grew, making her feel both small and exposed, like she was under the microscope of a room full of people who hadn't even noticed the slight. Her breath caught in her chest, and she couldn't help but feel the subtle sting of something more insidious. She wasn't new here. Jake had served her countless times before without hesitation. He knew her. She was a regular, always polite, never causing any trouble. But now, tonight, it was like she didn't even exist. The longer she sat there, the more she felt her frustration building. It wasn't just the waiting, it was the complete disregard, the fact that he didn't even glance her way. She knew what this felt like. She had been here before, in moments where people didn't look her in the eye or passed over her in a room full of people, assuming she didn't matter. She had learned to swallow those feelings, to fight them off and keep her head up. But tonight, something snapped. Jake had looked at her when he first saw her enter the bar, so why was he now treating her like a ghost? Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of the bar. She couldn't let it slide. Not this time. She'd been patient, but now she felt like something deeper was at play. Something beyond just a bad night for the bartender. This was more personal. This was about who she was, and she was no longer going to sit back and accept it. She stood up, slowly this time, and walked to the other side of the bar, where Jake was busy pouring a drink for another customer. She leaned over the counter and spoke again, this time directly to him. "Jake," she said, her voice steady but sharp, "what's going on? I've been sitting here for over half an hour and you haven't said a word to me. Why am I being ignored?" Jake froze for a moment, looking at her as though he hadn't expected her to speak up. His eyes flicked toward the other customers, his hand still hovering over the bottle. But when he finally met her gaze, there was no warmth in his expression. Just a guarded, almost defensive look. "I'm busy," he muttered, barely making eye contact before turning his attention back to the men at the end of the bar. Sarah's frustration flared. She had given him a chance to apologize, to acknowledge what was happening, but instead he dismissed her once again. "No," she said, a little louder now. "You're not too busy. I've seen you talk to every other person in here. What's wrong with me?" Jake stiffened, the tension between them rising. There was a moment where neither spoke, just the hum of the bar surrounding them. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to let him continue acting like she was invisible. She wasn't going to let this slide anymore. He shrugged slightly, his posture suddenly tight. "Look, it's nothing personal," he said, but his words felt hollow. "I'm just trying to get the orders done." "No," Sarah said again, this time with more force. "It is personal. You're ignoring me on purpose, and I want to know why." The words hung in the air. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence between them, and Sarah saw the flicker of something, fear maybe, flash across Jake's face. He wasn't looking at her now. Instead, he was looking down as if ashamed of what he had done. The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of his actions settling over the space like a thick fog. She waited, staring him down until finally Jake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to offend you," he muttered, but the words seemed rehearsed, insincere. I'm just trying to get through the night." Sarah didn't believe him. She had heard that excuse too many times in her life. People always said they didn't mean to offend her, didn't mean to treat her like she didn't belong, but it always felt the same. The silence, the avoidance, the subtle message that she didn't matter as much as everyone else. She looked around at the other patrons in the bar who were now staring at her. Their eyes darted back and forth between Sarah and Jake, but no one spoke up. The air in the room had thickened, charged with uncomfortable tension. She could feel it in her bones now. This wasn't just a case of bad service. It was something deeper, something that spoke to the heart of who she was and how the world sometimes chose to treat her. Sarah exhaled slowly, looking Jake square in the eye. "It's not okay, Jake," she said softly but firmly. "You need to realize that this behavior, this treatment, hurts, and it's not something you can brush off." Jake's face reddened, but he didn't say anything more. His mouth opened, then closed again, like he didn't have the words to apologize properly. Instead, he busied himself with the drinks in front of him, avoiding her gaze entirely. As Sarah turned away, she realized that this wasn't just about one bartender's mistake. It was about something bigger. It was about standing up for herself, for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, for every quiet moment of exclusion that went unnoticed. She could feel the eyes of the room on her as she left the bar. The night had changed for her. She wasn't just a woman seeking a drink anymore. She was someone who had just claimed her right to be seen. What happens when Sarah reveals who she really is? The moment Sarah turned to leave, she felt the weight of every gaze in the room, and for a fleeting second she considered walking out. She could just leave and forget about it. After all, what was the point of continuing to sit here and let this frustration eat away at her? She had endured moments like this before, moments where she was made to feel invisible, where people's prejudices crept into everyday situations. But tonight felt different. She wasn't going to just walk away. Sarah paused by the door, her hand resting on the cold metal handle. Her heart was racing, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. But more than that, she was tired. Tired of letting moments like this slide. Tired of letting people like Jake think they could get away with treating her like an afterthought. She wasn't going to just leave. Not tonight. With a deep breath, Sarah turned back toward the bar. She walked with purpose, the noise of the bar fading in the background as she approached the counter again. Her footsteps were steady, deliberate, each one filled with a quiet determination. When she reached the bar, she stood facing Jake, who was still avoiding her eyes. "Jake," she said, her voice firm but calm, "I'm not going anywhere, not until we talk about what just happened." Jake didn't look up at first. He was busy wiping down the bar, his back turned to her as he tried to avoid the situation. But Sarah could see his shoulders tense as if he was trying to shrink away from the confrontation. She could feel the air in the room thickening. The tension was palpable now. Everyone was waiting for what would happen next. "Look, I told you already," Jake muttered, his voice low. "I didn't mean anything by it. I'm just trying to do my job." Sarah wasn't having it. The words felt empty, like the kind of excuse she had heard too many times before. She had heard it from teachers, from colleagues, from strangers who thought they could act with impunity. She had heard it from people who didn't think twice about the consequences of their actions, and she was done accepting it. "No, Jake," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You didn't mean anything by it, but that doesn't change the fact that you ignored me. I've been sitting here for over an hour, and you treated me like I wasn't even here. That's not okay. That's not nothing." The words hit harder than she expected. She could see Jake stiffen, his fingers tightening around the towel he was holding. He didn't respond right away, but Sarah could feel his unease. He knew he had messed up. He could feel it in the way the room had fallen silent, the way the other patrons were watching, some pretending not to notice, others not sure whether to intervene. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't sit back and let him act like this was no big deal. It wasn't just about the drink. It wasn't even just about him. It was about something bigger. The way people like her were often overlooked, dismissed, or disregarded. It was about the quiet, insidious racism that crept into everyday encounters like the one she was facing right now. This wasn't just a minor mistake. This was a pattern, a behavior that had become normalized. "Jake," Sarah said again, her tone still calm but unwavering, "you've been serving everyone else. You've been joking with them, making small talk, being friendly. But when I walk in, you don't even acknowledge me. And that's the part that hurts. That's the part that makes me wonder if it's because of who I am, not just where I'm sitting." There was a long pause as the words settled in the air between them. Jake finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something there. Embarrassment, maybe, or guilt. But Sarah didn't care. She wasn't looking for him to feel sorry for her. She wasn't even sure if he could truly understand the weight of what had just happened. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about him. This was about her. This was about the dignity she had been denied and the courage it took to stand up for herself. I didn't mean it like that," Jake said, his voice faltering. "I wasn't trying to be, I don't know, rude or anything." "I know you weren't," Sarah replied, her voice softening a little but not giving up. "But that's the problem, Jake. People don't mean to be racist, don't mean to be disrespectful. But when it happens over and over again, it still hurts. It still matters." Jake stood there, his hands hanging by his sides, unsure of what to say. He opened his mouth a few times, but no words came out. The awkwardness hung in the air like a thick fog. It was clear that he didn't have an answer, that he didn't know how to make things right. Just then, the door to the bar swung open again. The low rumble of conversation in the back stopped for a moment as a tall, middle-aged man entered the bar. It was Mr. Jackson, the owner of the establishment. Sarah had seen him around a few times before. He was a regular, someone who visited his bar often, but not a constant presence behind the counter. Jake's face went white when he saw Mr. Jackson. He quickly turned away from Sarah, his eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Jackson," Jake said, his voice tinged with nervousness. I didn't know. I didn't realize." But Mr. Jackson didn't acknowledge him right away. Instead, he looked straight at Sarah, who had now stepped back from the bar, her arms crossed over her chest. Sarah had seen the shift in Jake's behavior the second Mr. Jackson walked in. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was fear. Fear that he had crossed a line he couldn't undo. Mr. Jackson gave a small, reassuring nod to Sarah, acknowledging her presence without saying anything. Then he turned to Jake. "What's going on here?" Mr. Jackson's voice was calm, but it had an edge to it. Sarah wasn't about to let this go. She stepped forward, meeting Mr. Jackson's gaze. "It's simple," she said, her voice steady. "Jake's been ignoring me all night. I've been sitting here for over an hour trying to get his attention, but he keeps serving everyone else without even acknowledging me. And when I finally asked him what was going on, he got defensive." Mr. Jackson's brow furrowed. "Jake," he said sharply, his tone now more commanding, "what's going on?" Jake shifted uncomfortably behind the bar, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to," he began, but Mr. Jackson cut him off. "You didn't mean to? That's not good enough, Jake. Not here. Not in this bar." Jake stammered, his gaze flickering between Sarah and Mr. Jackson, but the weight of the situation seemed to settle over him. Sarah could see it now. His facade of confidence was completely gone. The look in his eyes had shifted from defensiveness to something else entirely. Regret. "Mr. Jackson," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with remorse, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make her feel uncomfortable. I just wasn't thinking." But the damage was done. Sarah wasn't sure if an apology would make any difference. She had heard apologies like this before, apologies that came too late. But tonight, something had changed. Sarah had stood up for herself. She wasn't just a customer at a bar anymore. She was someone who had finally found her voice. Will Sarah accept the apology, or is it too late for Jake? The bar was silent for a moment, the weight of Jake's apology hanging in the air. But Sarah didn't rush to accept it. She wasn't sure if words alone could fix the situation. Apologies, especially the ones given in haste, had a way of feeling empty when they were the result of being caught in the act. She had heard "I'm sorry" too many times before, and each time it felt like it was said more to make the speaker feel better than to actually acknowledge the harm caused. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her attention to Mr. Jackson, who was still standing behind the bar, watching the exchange unfold. He hadn't spoken yet, but there was a subtle shift in the air when Sarah looked at him. She could tell he had been watching the entire situation, not just the altercation, but everything leading up to it. There was an understanding there, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't just about bad service or a misunderstanding. It was about the larger issues of respect and the way people like her were treated. "Mr. Jackson," Sarah said, her voice steady but calm, "I didn't come here tonight looking for drama. I just wanted to relax. But what happened tonight? It wasn't right. I don't want this to just blow over. This isn't just a bad night for Jake. This is something bigger, something that needs to be addressed." Mr. Jackson nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was carefully considering his words. There was a long pause before he spoke, but when he did, his voice was firm and thoughtful. "I've been running this bar for over 20 years, and I've always believed in treating people with respect," Mr. Jackson began, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But tonight, I can see that there's something I haven't been paying enough attention to." He turned to Jake, his expression hardening slightly. "Jake, you've worked for me long enough to know that we don't tolerate this kind of behavior here. You're lucky Sarah is giving you a chance to make this right. I won't stand by and let my customers be treated like that." Sarah could see that Mr. Jackson was upset. He wasn't just angry with Jake, he was upset with himself for not noticing the subtle signs of disrespect that had been brewing in his establishment. She appreciated his willingness to acknowledge the issue, but she still wasn't sure what would come of it. Apologies and words were a start, but it was the actions that followed that would determine if anything truly changed. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as Sarah thought the moment was winding down, Mr. Jackson did something that shocked both her and Jake. "Sarah, I'm sorry for what you've had to endure," Mr. Jackson said, "but I'm not just going to apologize. I want you to know that I'm committed to making sure this doesn't happen again. I'm going to make sure every staff member here understands what respect truly means. We're going to have a meeting tomorrow, and we're going to address this issue head-on." Sarah raised an eyebrow. She had expected an apology, maybe even a promise to talk to Jake, but this was different. Mr. Jackson wasn't just taking the easy route, he was committing to a change, to making sure this wasn't just an isolated incident but a wake-up call for the bar as a whole. And then, as if that wasn't surprising enough, Mr. Jackson turned to Jake and said, "And I think it's time for you to learn a little bit more about how to treat people, especially our regular customers." He turned to Sarah with a soft, sincere smile. "Jake is going to shadow you for the next few weeks. I want him to learn what it means to provide the kind of service that makes people feel welcomed and valued. You've been coming here for a long time, Sarah. You know how we should be treating our customers. I trust you to help guide him." Sarah was stunned. She hadn't expected that. It was one thing to offer an apology, but to turn Jake's mistake into an opportunity for growth. To have him shadow her? It was a bold move, and it showed that Mr. Jackson wasn't just offering lip service, he was genuinely invested in making things right. Jake's face flushed with embarrassment, but Sarah could see the realization dawning on him. He hadn't just been called out, he was being given a chance to make a meaningful change, to learn and grow from this experience. It wasn't a punishment, it was an opportunity, and for the first time, Sarah saw a genuine look of remorse in his eyes, not because he was caught, but because he understood the weight of what he had done. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice quieter now, "I know I messed up, and I'm sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to learn how to do better." There was a sincerity in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I'll be better." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, trying to gauge whether he truly understood the impact of his actions. She could feel the shift in the air, the tension lifting slightly as she considered his words. Part of her wanted to remain distant, to stay guarded, but another part of her realized that sometimes real growth came from moments like these, and if Jake was willing to learn, then maybe it was worth giving him the chance to prove it. She nodded, her expression softening. "I appreciate that, Jake. But it's not just about you learning. It's about everyone. Every single person in here being treated with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. That's what matters." Jake nodded, and Mr. Jackson placed a hand on his shoulder. "And we'll make sure that happens. No more excuses. We'll do better." Sarah felt a small sense of relief, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. Words were one thing, but actions were another. She wasn't going to just forget what had happened, but she could see that Mr. Jackson was committed to making this right, and that was a step in the right direction. As she turned to leave, she glanced back at Jake and Mr. Jackson. The weight of the situation hadn't fully lifted, but there was something different now. Something had shifted in the air. Jake was being held accountable, and Sarah's voice had been heard. She wasn't just a customer anymore. She had made a difference tonight. What's next for Sarah and Jake? Will he truly change, or is it just a temporary fix? As Sarah stepped back from the bar, the tension in the room seemed to linger in the air, heavy and palpable. Jake stood at the counter, his hands now clasped together as though he were trying to hold on to whatever shred of dignity remained after the confrontation. Mr. Jackson's presence, calm but firm, had undoubtedly changed the dynamic, but the moment wasn't over. It wasn't over for Sarah, and it wasn't over for Jake either. Sarah wasn't sure what she expected to happen next. She had spoken her truth, stood her ground, and demanded respect, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. But a small part of her wondered if she had truly made a difference. She wasn't naive. She knew people didn't change overnight. That didn't mean she wasn't hopeful, just cautious. Jake's earlier apology had been rushed and insincere, but Sarah could tell something had shifted in him after Mr. Jackson had spoken. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by something else, a quiet understanding that perhaps he had not fully grasped the impact of his actions before. The sting of his behavior had been felt by Sarah, but it had also been a lesson for him. The question now was whether that lesson would stick or fade away as quickly as the apology. Mr. Jackson broke the silence first. He nodded to Sarah, acknowledging her without words, and then turned to Jake, his tone resolute. "Jake, I expect better from you," Mr. Jackson said, his voice steady. "You're not just here to serve drinks. You're here to treat people with respect. That's the foundation of this business, and if you don't understand that by now, it's time you learned. Sarah just taught you a lesson, but don't think it ends here. I won't stand by and let this happen again." Jake nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He wasn't just hearing the words. He was feeling them. For the first time, Sarah could see that he truly understood. But there was still work to be done. "Sarah," Mr. Jackson continued, turning back to her, "I want to personally thank you for speaking up. It's not easy to confront something like this, and it takes courage to call out bad behavior. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again, and I'll personally oversee the training we'll be doing to ensure the bar's policies on respect and inclusivity are more than just words. We want every customer to feel welcome, no matter who they are." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she heard Mr. Jackson's words. This wasn't just a surface-level apology. It was a commitment to change. She appreciated his willingness to take responsibility for what had happened and to address the issue head-on. In a world where people often swept things under the rug, where uncomfortable truths were ignored for the sake of peace, this felt like something real. It felt like action. Jake had been given a second chance, and now it was up to him to prove that he could learn from this experience. Sarah wasn't sure if everything would be fixed immediately. She knew change took time, but she could see that Jake was at least starting to understand the gravity of what he had done. He wasn't just sorry that he'd been caught, he was sorry for how he had made her feel. That was the first step. Turning to Sarah, Jake spoke again, this time with more sincerity in his voice. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I know I can't take back what happened. But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I didn't realize how much it hurt until you pointed it out. I'll do better, I swear. I don't want to be that kind of person." Sarah studied him for a moment. She could see the weight of his words, the remorse in his eyes. But more than that, she could see the commitment to change. She wasn't naive enough to think that a single apology could undo everything. But she also knew that sometimes it was the first step toward growth. It was the beginning of a process, not the end. "You don't have to be perfect, Jake," Sarah said, her voice calm and steady. "You just need to be aware of how your actions affect people. We all make mistakes, but it's what we do after we realize we've made them that counts. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. But don't make me regret that." Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no defensiveness in his expression, just a quiet understanding. He had heard her, and he knew that the road ahead would require him to prove himself, not just to Sarah, but to anyone else he had ever made feel invisible. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice small but earnest. "I won't forget this." Mr. Jackson gave a small nod of approval before turning back to Sarah. "I'll make sure the staff training goes beyond just words," he said. "We'll do better. We'll make sure this bar is a place where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve." For a moment, Sarah stood there in silence, taking it all in. She felt a small sense of satisfaction, but more than that, she felt a quiet pride. Tonight hadn't just been about defending herself. It had been about something bigger, about standing up for the countless people who had been ignored, overlooked, or treated as less than. She wasn't just a black woman sitting at a bar anymore. She had used her voice, and her voice had made a difference. As she turned to leave, she felt a weight lift from her chest. The confrontation had been uncomfortable, but necessary. Jake had been given the opportunity to learn and grow, and Mr. Jackson had taken responsibility for the failure in his business. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. As Sarah walked toward the door, she paused, her hand resting on the handle. She glanced back one last time, taking in the scene. Jake wiping down the counter, his head slightly lowered as he processed what had just happened. Mr. Jackson was speaking to him in low tones, offering guidance, ensuring the lessons had sunk in. It wasn't the perfect ending, but it was real, and that was enough for Sarah. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but every small victory, every moment of standing up for what was right mattered. She had made an impact tonight, and that was enough. As Sarah walked out into the night, she felt the cool air hit her skin, a sense of calm washing over her. She hadn't just left the bar behind, she had left it changed. Will Jake live up to his promise, or will the lessons fade? Sarah stepped out of the bar into the cool night air, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. The weight that had been pressing down on her all evening, the frustration, the anger, began to lift, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. She had stood up for herself, for something bigger than just a simple drink at a bar. She had used her voice to challenge a wrong, and for once it felt like it had made a real difference. As she walked down the dimly lit street, she reflected on what had just happened. The confrontation had been difficult, uncomfortable even. She had never been one to cause a scene, but sometimes silence didn't bring change. Sometimes you had to speak up, no matter how difficult it was. Jake's actions weren't just a mistake. They were a symptom of a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed. But tonight, she had made sure it wasn't swept under the rug. What struck Sarah most was how quickly Mr. Jackson had reacted. He hadn't dismissed her concerns or tried to downplay Jake's behavior. Instead, he had taken responsibility for the environment his bar had allowed to fester. That, in itself, was a rare and powerful thing. Not everyone would have done that. Not everyone would have listened. But Mr. Jackson had, and that gave Sarah a quiet sense of hope. When Jake had apologized, there had been sincerity in his words. At first, Sarah hadn't believed him. She had heard too many hollow apologies, too many promises made in the heat of the moment. But something had shifted in Jake's demeanor. He hadn't just apologized because he was caught. He apologized because he understood the gravity of what he had done, and he was committed to doing better. Of course, Sarah knew it wasn't going to be an instant fix. Change didn't happen overnight. Jake had to prove that he could take the lessons he had learned and apply them moving forward. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had been seen. Her voice had been heard, and it had made a difference. She had been treated as more than just a customer. She had been treated as a person, with dignity and respect. As Sarah reached the corner of the block, she paused and glanced back at the bar one last time. The soft glow from the window illuminated the scene inside. Jake and Mr. Jackson still talking, the conversation continuing behind the bar. She didn't know what would happen from here, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. And that was all she needed to feel, that for once, things could be different. She turned and walked away, her footsteps lighter than they had been when she first entered the bar. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't expect Jake's transformation to be perfect. But for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt hopeful. One small step toward change had been taken tonight, and that made all the difference. As she reached her car and slid into the driver's seat, a sense of peace washed over her. It had been a long night, but a night worth fighting for. The battle wasn't over. There were more challenges ahead, but tonight Sarah had made sure that one wrong was righted. That, in itself, was victory. Will Sarah's story inspire others to take a stand? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful moments of change and inspiration.